I spent for months convinced my neighbor was dangerous and called the police on him. Then he invited me inside and I saw everything. I want to tell you about the 6 months I spent believing my neighbor was dangerous before I tell you what I eventually found out, because the gap between those two things is the whole point of this story, and I do not want you to lose sight of it. I moved into the house on Merritt Lane in April of the year I turned 32. It was a small street, 11 houses, the kind of neighborhood that still had a particular quality of quiet that felt increasingly rare. No through traffic, old trees, the kind of sidewalks where people actually walked in the evenings instead of just driving past each other. I had chosen it specifically for the quiet. I had come out of 3 years in an apartment in the city centre where the noise had been constant and had begun to feel, by the end, like a physical pressure I was living inside of. I needed the opposite of that. Merritt Lane was the opposite of that. My house was number 7. The house directly across the street was number 8. The man who lived in number 8 was named Vincent Pryor, and he was the first thing about Merritt Lane that did not match the picture. He was in his mid-50s, I estimated. Heavyset, grey at the temples, the kind of man who takes up space without appearing to try. He drove a dark-coloured sedan that he kept immaculately clean. He had no visible visitors. He kept unusual hours, lights on late, sometimes very late, and then the house completely dark until mid-afternoon the following day. He did not wave when I moved in. He did not introduce himself. He watched from his front window sometimes when I was bringing in groceries or getting the mail, not in an obvious or aggressive way, just present. The curtain shifted slightly, the sense of being observed without being approached. I told myself it was nothing. People kept to themselves. Not everyone was a waving and introducing type. I had lived in cities long enough to know that the absence of neighborly warmth was not evidence of anything except a preference for privacy. But there was something about the watching that sat with me. By the end of my first month I had noticed enough individual things that I had begun, unconsciously at first and then quite deliberately, to compile them. The hours. The lack of visitors. The car that left sometimes at 11 p.m. and returned at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday with no apparent explanation. The way he moved around the outside of his property, purposefully, efficiently, with the specific economy of someone who did not want to be outside longer than necessary. The fact that in 4 weeks of living directly across from him, I had not once seen him have a conversation with another human being. I mentioned it to my friend Cassie, who had known me long enough to both take me seriously and challenge me when I needed challenging. She said I was probably lonely and projecting, and that moving to a quiet street after years of city living had left my threat detection calibrated for an environment I was no longer in. I said that was possible. I also said that possible and true were not the same thing. I started paying more deliberate attention in June. I am not proud of all of it. I want to be honest about that upfront. Some of what I did in those weeks sits uncomfortably with me even now when I understand the full picture. I started keeping a log. Times he left, times he returned, any variation in the pattern. I noted the days the lights stayed on past 2 a.m., more frequent than I had initially registered, sometimes 4 or 5 nights in a row. I noted that he occasionally carried things from his car to the house in a way that seemed deliberate about not being observed, backing the car into the driveway so the trunk faced the house rather than the street, moving quickly, never leaving anything sitting out. I know how this sounds. I knew how it sounded at the time. I was a woman living alone on a quiet street, keeping a log of her neighbor's movements in a notes app on her phone. I had consumed enough true crime content in my life to be aware that I was inhabiting the opening act of a specific kind of story. I was also aware, and this is the part that kept me from stopping, that the people in those stories who had ignored their instincts had generally regretted it. In July, I did something I have gone back and forth on since. I called the non-emergency police line and described what I had observed. I was careful. I did not make accusations. I described the pattern, the hours, the car, the behavior, and asked if there was anything on record about the address that I should be aware of as a new resident. The officer I spoke to was patient and thorough and told me there was nothing on record about that address and that what I had described did not constitute anything actionable, but that I was welcome to call again if anything escalated. He also said, gently, that unusual hours and a preference for privacy were not in themselves indicators of anything concerning. I thanked him and got off the phone feeling simultaneously validated that I had done something and deflated that it had yielded nothing. August is when the direct interaction happened. The one that changed the texture of everything. I was in my front garden on a Saturday morning, doing the extremely domestic and unthreatening activity of pulling weeds from around the base of a rosebush, when I heard his front door open. I did not look up immediately. I heard footsteps on his porch and then a pause and then his voice, which I had not heard before, lower than I expected, deliberate, the voice of someone who chose their words before releasing them. He said, "I know you have been watching me." I looked up. He was standing at the edge of his porch, not moving toward me, arms at his sides. His expression was not aggressive. It was tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has had a version of this moment before and had hoped not to have it again. I did not pretend he was wrong. I said I had noticed some things and had been trying to understand them. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Would you like to come inside?" Everything in my body said no. Everything in my body also said that this was the moment the story either became something or resolved itself, and that standing in my front garden saying no and going back inside would not actually make me safer. It would just put the uncertainty back in the drawer where I had been living for 4 months. I said yes. I want to be precise about what his house looked like inside because I think the details matter for understanding what I understood when I walked in. It was not what I expected. I had built, over 4 months of observation and lock-keeping and true crime-adjacent catastrophizing, a particular interior for that house. Something sparse and controlled and difficult to read. What I actually walked into was a home office that had consumed the entire ground floor. Every surface was covered. Not in a chaotic way, organized, meticulously, in the specific way of someone who had a system that made complete sense to them and would take some explaining to anyone else. Stacks of papers sorted by color-coded tabs, multiple monitors on a desk that had clearly been chosen for function rather than aesthetics. Bookshelves that were full in the precise way of someone who actually reads every book rather than displaying them. Post-it notes on a corkboard above the desk covered in handwriting too small to read from where I stood. He made tea without asking if I wanted it. He set a cup in front of me at the kitchen table, which was the one surface in the house that appeared to be used for something other than work, and he sat across from me and said he was going to tell me something he did not generally tell people because he found that once people knew, the dynamic changed in a way he found exhausting. He was a writer. Not a novelist, a researcher and writer who worked on long-form investigative projects, the kind that took years, that required sustained and irregular hours, that involved the kind of material that could not be left visible when people came to the door, which was why he had no visitors and why he backed the car into the driveway when he was bringing home physical documents and why he kept the hours he kept because the work did not observe a schedule and neither did he. He said he had lived on Merritt Lane for 9 years and had had 3 neighbors across the street in that time, and that I was the second one who had called the police on him. He said it without bitterness, just as information, in the same deliberate way he apparently did everything. He said he understood. He said it looked like exactly what it looked like and that he had made a decision years ago to simply live the life the work required and accept that it would occasionally generate concern in people who lived close enough to observe it. I sat at his kitchen table with my tea and I thought about 4 months of log entries and a phone call to the police and a personal mythology I had constructed about the man across the street that had been, in its entirety, wrong. I asked him what he was working on. He looked at me for a moment as if assessing something. Then he turned one of the monitors toward me slightly and showed me the opening page of a document. It was an investigation into financial fraud inside a regional healthcare network. 3 years of work. Interviews, documents, data. He said he hoped to publish within the year. I looked at the screen and then at the man sitting across from me who had spent 9 years on a quiet street working alone on things that mattered and being periodically reported to the police by his neighbors for the crime of keeping unusual hours and a clean car and a preference for not being seen. I apologized. Directly and without qualification. I told him I had called the non-emergency line in July and that I was sorry and that I had constructed a version of him that bore no relationship to who he actually was. He said he appreciated that. He said most people did not apologize. He said it like it was a small thing, which told me it was not a small thing. We talked for 2 hours, not about his work specifically and not about my 4 months of surveillance exactly, but around both of those things in the way of 2 people who have just recalibrated their understanding of each other and are testing what the new understanding feels like in conversation. He was not warm exactly. Warmth was not his register. But he was interesting in the way that people are interesting when they have spent years paying close attention to things that most people do not pay attention to. He asked me questions that were specific rather than polite. I answered them honestly because it seemed like the only appropriate currency in that room. When I left, he walked me to his front door and said that if I ever had concerns I was welcome to knock rather than observe. He said it without irony. I said I would. I walked back across the street to number 7 and stood in my own hallway for a while. That was 18 months ago. Vincent and I are not friends in the conventional sense. We do not socialize or share meals or exchange the ordinary currency of neighborhood friendliness. What we are is something I do not have a precise word for. 2 people who know something real about each other and have found a way to exist in proximity to that knowledge without making it strange. He waves now when I get the mail. I wave back. Occasionally one of us will be outside at the same time, and we will talk for 10 minutes about something neither of us would describe as small talk because neither of us is particularly good at small talk. He finished his investigation in February. It was published in a long-form journal I had heard of but not read regularly. I read it in one sitting. It was exceptional. I sent him a note through his door saying so, and he knocked on mine the following evening to thank me, and we stood on my front step for 20 minutes talking about it. I think about the 4 months of log entries sometimes. I think about how completely and efficiently I had built a false picture of a person from accurate observations. Every individual thing I had noted was real: the hours, the car, the behavior. The conclusions I had drawn from those real things were entirely wrong. Not because I was foolish, because I was working with incomplete information and filling the gaps with fear, which is what humans do, which is what I do, which is apparently what at least 2 of Vincent's previous neighbors did before me. My therapist, who I started seeing about 8 months ago for reasons only tangentially related to this story, asked me what I had learned from it. I said I had learned that surveillance without conversation is just anxiety with a log. She wrote something down. I assumed she agreed. I still live on Merritt Lane. I still find it quiet in the way I needed when I moved here. The trees are older looking than they were 18 months ago, or maybe I just notice them more now. Number 8 across the street has lights on late most nights. I see them sometimes when I get up for water or cannot sleep. They used to make me reach for my phone. Now they just mean Vincent is working. There is something almost comforting about it. The specific reassurance of knowing that across the street in the dark someone is paying close attention to something that matters. I have stopped keeping a log. I have not stopped paying attention. Those 2 things, I have learned, are not the same. I do not have a verdict to ask for. I was wrong about someone and I found out and I apologized and we figured out what to do with each other afterward. I guess I just want to know if any of you have ever built a complete and convincing picture of a person that turned out to share no relationship with who they actually were, and what it did to the way you look at people after. Because it did something to the way I look at people. I am still working out exactly what.